In the early months of World War II, Japan believed it had done the impossible. Its navy had swept across the Pacific with precision, speed, and ruthless efficiency. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. The rising sun flew over territories stretching thousands of miles. In Tokyo's war rooms, the admiral studied maps, charts, and estimates calculating the enemy's remaining strength, their intelligence. Officers concluded that the United States Navy could field roughly 296,000 sailors, a formidable but finite number. To the imperial planners, that figure was manageable, even conquerable. Japan's naval air power was unmatched, its officers elite and its sailors fiercely loyal. With skill, strategy, and spirit, they believed they could overwhelm a complacent America before its industry could awaken. On paper, the numbers made sense. America was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Public morale was uncertain, and the Pacific stretched vast and unforgiving. Japanese command believed that by striking fast and negotiating later, they could force the U.S. into submission before its shipyards roared to life. Every assumption, every strategy, every bold maneuver was built upon that single estimate. But the estimate was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. What the Japanese high command didn't yet grasp was that they hadn't attacked a sleeping giant, they had struck a giant that was about to stand up. In the quiet factories of America's heartland, the first sparks of retribution had already begun. The nation that had once measured its sailors in thousands was about to measure them in millions. Men from farms, factories, and small towns enlisted by the hundreds of thousands. Women flooded assembly lines, welding, riveting, and building the ships that would carry them. Within a year, the numbers Japan had written down in neat columns would mean nothing. But in 1942, the Japanese didn't know that. They looked across the Pacific and saw only weakness, an enemy still dazed, still counting losses, still finding its footing. They believed time was on their side. They couldn't yet see the storm coming, the storm of production, manpower, and relentless resolve. They couldn't imagine that the number they'd written in ink, 296,000, would one day be replaced by a figure that defied belief. And when they finally realized the truth, it would already be too late. For the Japanese High Command, the number 296,000 represented the entire might of the U.S. Navy's manpower, a calculation drawn from pre-war intelligence, outdated reports, and the assumption that America would take years to mobilize. But by mid-1943, reality was rewriting every line of their data. Because while Japanese analysts studied maps and measured fleet movements, something far larger and far quieter was happening across the ocean. America wasn't merely rebuilding its navy. It was reinventing what a nation at war could be. The United States had entered what historians would later call total mobilization. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shocked a peacetime society into industrial overdrive. Shipyards that once built merchant vessels now laid the keels of aircraft carriers. Automobile factories swapped engines for turbines, and small machine shops began producing torpedoes, shell casings, and radar parts. The country's vast economic machinery, from Detroit to Los Angeles, was being retooled for one purpose: to drown the Axis powers in production. At first, the shift seemed chaotic. There were shortages, errors, and confusion, but within months a kind of organized rhythm emerged, a rhythm that no other nation could match. America had something few others possessed: infinite capacity and infinite optimism. Men lined up at recruitment offices. By the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, they signed their names, took their oaths, and boarded trains bound for boot camps that had to be built faster than they could be filled. Training centers appeared like small cities overnight, from Great Lakes to San Diego, from Norfolk to Pearl Harbor itself. Meanwhile, factories pulsed day and night. Women took over welding torches and assembly lines. Teenagers drove forklifts. Housewives riveted hull plates and installed aircraft wiring. The line between civilian and soldier began to blur. The entire country had become part of the Navy's bloodstream. By 1944, the U.S. Navy's personnel count had exploded. The number Japan once believed to be the limit, 296,000, was now a small fraction of the truth. The real number stood at 234,343 sailors, spread across hundreds of ships, submarines, and air stations around the globe. It was a number so vast that even American commanders struggled to grasp it. To Japan, the revelation came slowly, like a creeping shadow. Intercepted communications, reconnaissance reports, and battlefield encounters hinted at something terrifying. No matter how many ships were sunk, more kept arriving. Each carrier they destroyed seemed to return multiplied. Each sailor lost at sea was replaced within weeks. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, had once warned his superiors, "In the first 6 months of war with the United States and Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." He was right. The math had betrayed them, because war in the modern age wasn't won by bravery alone. It was won by numbers, the kind that filled shipyards, training rosters, and payroll ledgers. Japan's mistake was believing that America's strength was measured only in ships and guns. It wasn't. It was measured in capacity, the ability to outbuild, outtrain, and outlast any opponent on Earth. When Japanese analysts finally updated their figures and saw the true size of the U.S. naval force, 2 million sailors strong, the shock was profound. That number didn't just represent men in uniform. It represented an entire civilization mobilized for survival. And in that moment, deep inside Japan's war ministry, realization dawned. They had underestimated not just an enemy, but a people. They had counted the ships and missed the spirit, because behind every one of those 2 million sailors stood a nation of 130 million Americans, united, determined, and now unstoppable. When Japan calculated that America could muster only 296,000 sailors, it was counting ships, bases, and fleets, but not factories. It was a mistake that would decide the war, because America's greatest weapon wasn't a plane or a battleship. It was industry, vast, tireless, and self-replicating. While Japan measured resources in barrels of oil and tons of steel, the United States began measuring victory in assembly lines. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been meant to cripple America's ability to fight. Instead, it had triggered something far greater, a total conversion of the American economy into a war-making machine. Within months, factories that once built cars, tractors, and refrigerators were turning out engines for destroyers, turrets for tanks, and aircraft by the thousands. Detroit became known as the arsenal of democracy. Same assembly lines that once built sedans now produced the massive Wright Cyclone engines that powered the P-47 Thunderbolt and the B-17 Flying Fortress. Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship before the war, began launching new Liberty ships in as little as 4 days, a speed the world had never seen. Every corner of the nation hummed with purpose. In Seattle, Boeing's hangars expanded into entire cities of steel and rivets. In California, aircraft plants stretched for miles under corrugated roofs. In New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, molten metal poured from furnaces around the clock. America's industrial base didn't just supply the front, it created it. This transformation wasn't magic. It was coordination, discipline, and belief, a shared conviction that the war could be won only through production without pause. Government, business, and labor formed an uneasy but effective alliance. The War Production Board set quotas so vast they seemed impossible. 50,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, millions of rifles, hundreds of ships. Yet one by one, those targets were met and then surpassed. The miracle wasn't just in scale, it was in speed. A destroyer that had once taken 2 years to build was now completed in 6 months. Shipyards launched vessels faster than Japan could sink them. Entire fleets appeared seemingly out of nowhere, rising from coastal waters like mechanical leviathans. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. The soul of this mobilization was the people behind it, the men and women who left comfort and complacency to serve a cause larger than themselves. Women filled 37% of the industrial workforce. They learned to weld, rivet, and operate heavy cranes. Rosie the Riveter became not just a poster, but a symbol of determination. A reminder that every rivet driven at home helped keep a sailor alive overseas. Teenagers lied about their age to enlist. Retired machinists returned to train new recruits. The hum of production became America's new heartbeat. By 1944, this collective effort had achieved something no enemy could match: industrial immortality. Even if a carrier was sunk today, 2 more were already on the way. If 10,000 sailors were lost, 20,000 were being trained. Japan, fighting with limited resources and overextended lines, could only watch as America's war machine gained unstoppable momentum. In Tokyo, intelligence officers began calling it the impossible tide. Every day the number of American ships grew. Every day more planes appeared in the skies over the Pacific. It wasn't a miracle. It was the sound of factories doing the work of armies. Japan had built warriors. America had built an engine. And that engine, loud, relentless, and infinite, would soon roll across the oceans, carrying with it the weight of a nation that refused to lose. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific was a chessboard of fire and steel. Japan's navy still appeared unstoppable, its carriers dominant, its pilots elite, and its admirals confident. But behind the smoke and flames of early victories, the tide of war had already begun to shift. America's hidden weapon, industrial scale, was about to make itself known. The first sign came at Midway. 4 Japanese carriers, symbols of their naval supremacy, were sent to crush the last fragments of U.S. power in the Pacific, but instead they were met by American codebreakers, courageous pilots, and something the Japanese hadn't expected: replacement strength. Unlike Japan, which was gambling its core fleet, the United States could afford losses. When a carrier went down, another was already under construction. When a squadron was wiped out, new recruits were already training to take their place. Midway was not just a victory of tactics, it was a victory of endurance. The Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable aviators. America lost 1 carrier, and by the time the smoke cleared, new ships were already being laid down. The myth of Japanese invincibility had cracked, and from that moment, the Pacific began to tilt westward. Then came Guadalcanal, a brutal test of will that turned the Pacific War into a grinding contest of attrition. The island itself was small, but its significance was enormous. Whoever controlled it would control the sea lanes between America and Australia. For 6 months, both sides fought in darkness, starvation, and chaos. Battleships clashed at night, planes roared over jungles, and soldiers fought for every inch of volcanic soil. But as the weeks turned into months, one fact became undeniable: America could send more. More planes, more fuel, more food, more men. For every Japanese transport sunk, 3 new American convoys arrived. For every Japanese pilot killed, 10 new American pilots took to the skies. The Imperial Navy was bleeding, not because it lacked courage, but because it lacked replacements. Japan had entered the war with the best-trained naval aviators in the world. But its pilot training program was long and rigid. It couldn't keep up with the staggering losses. By contrast, the United States built massive flight schools, churning out thousands of new pilots every month. They weren't perfect, but they were relentless. On Guadalcanal's Henderson Field, American mechanics repaired planes using spare parts scavenged from wreckage. Ships damaged in battle limped back to ports like Pearl Harbor or San Diego, only to be repaired, refitted, and sent back faster than Japan could respond. It was an industrial miracle turned into battlefield rhythm. By early 1943, Japan's naval planners began to realize the nightmare that was unfolding. They had entered the war expecting to destroy a finite enemy. Instead, they had awakened an infinite one. The more they fought, the larger the enemy became. Midway and Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end, not through one decisive strike, but through the slow, unstoppable weight of production and manpower. Every new U.S. ship launched from American docks pushed Japan closer to exhaustion. Every sailor trained, every pilot graduated, every bullet manufactured, all were steps toward inevitable victory. As the war expanded, Japan's empire began to shrink, island by island, ship by ship. The Imperial Navy still fought with honor and desperation, but the outcome was already written in steel and smoke. Because by 1943, Japan was fighting the same battle every day, not against a single enemy fleet, but against American capacity itself, and capacity, once unleashed, could not be defeated. By 1943, Japan's war planners were no longer looking at maps. They were staring at arithmetic. The numbers that had once promised empire now whispered defeat. Every battle, every island, every ship lost revealed the same terrible truth. The enemy's strength wasn't diminishing, it was multiplying. Inside Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters, optimism had turned to silence. Officers once filled with pride now avoided eye contact in meetings. Reports arriving from the Pacific were grim. Ships sunk faster than they could be replaced. Air squadrons decimated, bases cut off and abandoned. But worse than the losses themselves was the realization that Japan's war machine had no future. Factories struggled to keep up. Fuel was scarce, steel was running out, and with every passing month, the once glorious Imperial Navy found itself outnumbered, outgunned and outproduced. In private, many Japanese admirals began to admit what they could never say aloud. The war was unwinnable. They had underestimated America's endurance, its industrial genius and its capacity for sacrifice. They had believed that courage and precision would triumph over mass and machinery, but now they saw what that miscalculation had created, a war of exhaustion that Japan could never survive. Intelligence officers struggled to explain the impossible. They reported new American ships appearing in every ocean, fleets of bombers blotting out the sky, and an endless rotation of fresh crews and sailors. Where were these men coming from? How could one nation sustain such output? The answer lay in something Japan had never possessed: a mobilized democracy. America's strength was not dictated from the top down. It was built from the bottom up. Each worker, each factory, each farmer was part of the war effort, willingly. The Japanese Empire fought with discipline and obedience. The United States fought with unity and purpose. That difference, invisible on paper, was decisive on the battlefield. As the pressure mounted, cracks began to form within the Imperial Command itself. Some officers argued for negotiation. Others demanded one final decisive battle to force America into peace talks. But deep down, most knew that even a single decisive victory would change nothing. For every American ship destroyed, 2 more would arrive. For every island retaken, 100 new bases were being built. The math was merciless. Pilots noticed it too. Where once the skies of the Pacific had belonged to the rising sun, now they were filled with swarms of American aircraft. New planes and faster, tougher, more numerous, filled the horizon. Japan's elite aviators, trained over years of careful instruction, were now being replaced by inexperienced recruits flying outdated machines. The balance had shifted permanently. The psychological toll was immense. For the first time in centuries, Japan's warrior class, on the heirs of samurai tradition, faced a war they could not win through willpower alone. Their spirit remained unbroken, but their faith in victory had begun to fracture. Letters from the front spoke not of triumph, but of endurance. Commanders urged their men to fight on, not for conquest, but for honor. The Imperial Navy was still fighting battles, but not to win the war. They were fighting to delay defeat, to protect what remained of their homeland, to buy time for a miracle that would never come. And in the quiet hours of Tokyo's war rooms, as reports of American fleets grew longer and longer, a haunting realization spread through the ranks. The war was already lost. They were just living through its unfolding. The Japanese had entered the Pacific confident that bravery would overcome numbers. Now, they understood the new reality of modern war. No amount of courage can outfight endless capacity. The soldiers still fought, the ships still sailed. But deep within Japan's high command, the war had already ended, not on the battlefield, but in the mind. When the Japanese intelligence officers finally recalculated America's naval manpower, the result was almost incomprehensible. They had estimated around 296,000 sailors, enough, they thought, to crew a few dozen major fleets. But when the real figure emerged, over 343 men and women in uniform, even hardened military minds fell silent. That number was not just a statistic, it was a revelation. It meant that America's naval power wasn't just a fleet. It was an entire civilization mobilized for what every one of those sailors represented something Japan could not replicate. A system of mass production, education, logistics, and willpower that stretched across a continent. They came from small towns and big cities, from farms in Kansas to factories in Detroit, from shipyards in California to harbors in New York. They were mechanics, Radio operators, cooks, engineers, and gunners, ordinary people, transformed into the largest naval force in history. Each American ship carried not only weapons but layers of human expertise. A single aircraft carrier was a floating city, thousands of men maintaining engines, preparing meals, navigating seas, and repairing damage under fire. Even if one man fell, another stepped forward. It was a system built not on heroism alone, but on redundancy, a design that ensured the machine never stopped moving. Japan, by contrast, could not sustain such depth. Their sailors were among the most skilled and disciplined in the world, but every loss was irreplaceable. When a ship sank, it took with it not just metal and guns, but years of training and experience. Each casualty was a hole in the nation's future. For the Americans, the opposite was true. Every sailor who died was mourned, but his place was filled. New recruits lined up, trained, deployed, and joined the fight. Factories didn't sleep. Shipyards didn't stop, and training schools didn't pause. The system absorbed its losses and kept moving forward, stronger with every iteration. That scale had a human rhythm of its own. Letters home flooded across the oceans. Families waited months for news, and in towns across America, gold stars began to appear in windows, symbols of sacrifice, that quietly told the story of a nation at war. 2 million sailors meant 2 million families bound together by purpose. The war effort was not something distant, and it was personal. Every town had a name on the casualty list. Every community felt the weight of the Pacific in its heart. Even within Japan, whispers of this human flood reached high command. Reports from submarines described American convoys that stretched beyond the horizon, dozens of ships moving in perfect formation, guarded by destroyers and carriers. For every Japanese attack, the Americans sent reinforcements before the damage could even matter. It was as if the ocean itself had turned into an American factory. This realization was devastating not just strategically, but spiritually. Japan's entire war philosophy had been built on the concept of the elite warrior, precision, courage, and sacrifice. But now they were facing something new: industrial humanity. An enemy not of individuals, but of systems, resilient, flexible, and endless. To the Japanese analysts counting those millions of sailors, the truth became undeniable. America was not fighting a war. It was conducting an operation of civilization, and no empire, no matter how brave, could withstand that kind of momentum forever. The number 234,343 was not just data on a report. It was the sound of engines roaring in unison, the creak of decks beneath boots, the hum of radio signals bouncing across the Pacific, the heartbeat of an unstoppable machine powered by millions of beating human hearts. And as Japan's leaders stared at that number in disbelief, one thought echoed through their minds. They hadn't just underestimated an army, they had underestimated an entire people. By 1944, the war in the Pacific was no longer just fought on islands or seas. It was fought on assembly lines. In America, the heartbeat of war thundered not from guns, but from machines. Steel mills glowed red through the night. Shipyards hammered without pause. Factories that once built cars now rolled out tanks, bombers, and landing craft. Every conveyor belt was a front line. Every rivet a bullet aimed at the axis. What Japan saw as a military contest, the United States had turned into a manufacturing operation, one so vast and efficient that it dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. At the start of the war, America's shipbuilding capacity was modest. By 1943, it had become almost supernatural. The U.S. Navy could lose a destroyer one week and commission another the next. Entire fleets seemed to appear out of thin air, but behind each ship was an invisible army of workers. Men and women welding, riveting, designing, and testing around the clock. The legendary Liberty ships symbolized this transformation. Simple, rugged cargo vessels. They weren't glamorous, but they were everywhere. Each one could be built in less than 50 days, some in as little as 2 weeks. More than 2,700 were launched, enough to carry the supplies that kept every soldier and sailor alive from Hawaii to the Philippines. They didn't just deliver goods. They delivered momentum. Japan couldn't comprehend this scale. Their industries were concentrated and vulnerable. Every bomb dropped on a factory or shipyard set them back. Months, Americas were decentralized, spread across a continent. Even if one plant went dark, 10 others kept producing. It was a system designed not just to win battles, but to absorb damage and keep growing stronger. Every aircraft carrier built in the U.S. carried within it thousands of components, each made by different hands in different towns. Engines from Michigan, steel from Pittsburgh, cables from California, all converging into a single war machine. It wasn't luck or chaos. It was logistics as art. No other nation could coordinate production, transport, and deployment at this speed. Meanwhile, innovation fed the machine. American engineers constantly simplified designs to increase output. Fewer parts, faster assembly, interchangeable components. The Grumman Hellcat, a fighter that dominated the Pacific skies, was designed to be rugged and easy to repair. Pilots could take off in the morning, fight, return damaged, and have their plane flight-ready by the next dawn. Efficiency had become a form of warfare. But what truly broke Japan's spirit wasn't just the machines. It was the tempo. Every month, new fleets appeared, new bombers, new submarines, new landing ships. For every Japanese ship that went down, the U.S. launched 5 more. For every airfield bombed, 2 new ones rose. America wasn't reacting. It was advancing at industrial speed. Tokyo's intelligence reports became increasingly surreal. They told of production numbers so vast that officers doubted their accuracy. Could one nation really produce 100,000 aircraft in a single year? Could its navy really crew millions of sailors, train tens of thousands of pilots, and fuel them across half the world? Yes, because by 1944, production itself had become strategy. While Japanese strategists argued over where to fight, America had decided how to win, through output. Victory would come not from luck, but from capacity multiplied by time. Every ton of steel forged, every ship launched, every plane built was a countdown toward inevitable domination. The Pacific was now filled with floating symbols of this power, carriers stacked with aircraft, destroyers slicing through waves, supply ships trailing like shadows. Each one represented not just engineering, but the will of a nation that refused to slow down. Japan's commanders understood what they were witnessing. The war was no longer being fought at sea, it was being decided in the factories. And as America's steel tide rolled endlessly westward, it became clear that no amount of bravery or strategy could stop a machine that turned industry into destiny. By mid-1945, Japan was fighting a war it no longer believed it could win. Its leaders didn't need American bombs to tell them that. The truth had already arrived in the form of numbers, reports, and silence. Silence from fleets that would never return. Silence from factories that could no longer produce. Silence from islands that had gone dark, one after another. The Japanese military had once imagined itself as an unstoppable wave sweeping across the Pacific. But by now, that wave had met the shore, the unbreakable wall of American industry and manpower. And with each new American ship that appeared on the horizon, the illusion of hope faded a little more. Inside the war rooms of Tokyo, the mood was no longer defiant, it was numb. Charts showed the shrinking perimeter of their empire. Red circles on maps marked bases that had fallen or were cut off. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. Ships were trapped in harbors for lack of oil. The mighty Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, now existed mostly on paper. Even Japan's most loyal officers could see it. The war had become a countdown. Every day, more American bombers appeared overhead. Every night, submarines prowled their shipping lanes, strangling the nation's lifelines. No convoy could move safely. No island could hold the ocean. Once, Japan's greatest weapon and had turned against. It then came the reports that finally broke their last illusions. American intelligence had intercepted Japan's own estimates and knew exactly how much they were losing, but the most haunting realization came from within Japan itself, from analysts comparing their assumptions to reality. For years, they had believed the U.S. Navy numbered around 296,000 sailors. That was manageable, but now the truth stood before them. Over 2,034,343 men and women were serving at sea, backed by tens of millions more on land. It was a number that shattered belief. It wasn't just a figure, it was a force of nature. Japan's leaders understood instantly what it meant. They weren't fighting another nation anymore. They were fighting an entire civilization armed with factories, freedom, and inexhaustible resolve. Some officers tried to cling to honor. They spoke of dying with dignity, of fighting to the last man, of inflicting just one more wound before the end. But others, and weary, haunted, and pragmatic, began to whisper what no one dared to say aloud. We have already lost. That realization didn't arrive with the atomic bombs. It came earlier, quietly, when Japan's last hopes were erased not by explosions, but by mathematics, when they saw the endless stream of American ships crossing the Pacific like a moving continent, when they realized that for every Japanese sailor lost, there were 10 Americans waiting to take his place, when they understood that their nation, no matter how brave, could not fight infinity. Even Emperor Hirohito, distant and divine in the eyes of his people, began to see the inevitability of collapse. He read the reports. He heard the advisors. He felt the desperation in every message from the front. And when he finally spoke to his people in August 1945, it wasn't as a god but as a man acknowledging the impossible. Japan had gambled everything on precision, courage, and willpower. America had countered with scale, machinery, and endurance. In the end, both fought with honor, but only one could fight forever. When the war finally ended, Japan lay in ruins. But in those ruins, a new understanding was born. That victory in modern war doesn't belong to the strongest, or even the bravest. It belongs to those who can sustain the fight, those who can replace what's lost and keep moving forward. The number 2,034,343 became a symbol not just of defeat, but of revelation. It marked the moment Japan stopped believing it could win, and started understanding the true cost of underestimating an opponent's capacity, unity, and will. The war had ended, but the lesson, that industrial might and human spirit combined are unstoppable, would echo for generations.